So hopefully everybody got a little bit of a stretch and some water, maybe some more caffeine or fructose, I guess. My name is Carol Tucker. I want to welcome everybody to the workshop, Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare Education. It is not only a hot topic, but it's also well-timed. And you're really going to listen to a group of experts and also contribute to discussion of this topic. So I'm Carol Tucker. I currently serve as the Associate Dean of Research at the University of Texas Medical Branch, also direct our Research Center in Health Promotion, Performance and Rehab Research, and chair the PT department because I don't like sleeping, amongst a few other things. But I've really been given the privilege of chairing this workshop. As somebody that has long been invested in AI, I trained as an engineer as well as a physical therapist. It's really near and dear to me, but it really, truly is the workshop planning committee that pulled all of this together very thoughtfully and very timely. And I am just honored to be kind of the figurehead, the chair of this. I also want to thank the members of the IHPE Forum for choosing this topic. Well done, and also for their financial support. So this is the second of a three-part, actually a four-part series. In the first part, which was about a week and a half ago, we discussed really what artificial intelligence is, provided some definitions, some examples that are germane to healthcare education, and really asked the question, why? What is our role in it? Why is it necessary for us as health professionals and educators to understand and really become conversational in the role of AI across all the health professions? Really, if we want to have an impact on where AI is going and how it impacts our patients and our students and ourselves, I think this is just really the first step. It's a call to action for us to really think about embedding the structure of education more formally. During that pre-conference workshop, we heard different responses to the question of why. Why is it important? And a key reason is really, ChatGPT is already on generation 4. It's here to stay. It's going to be in healthcare, and we just really need to look at the technology, think about all the benefits it can have, and think of how we can influence its healthy transition into part of healthcare and healthcare education. This brings us to today's session, followed by tomorrow morning, where we will really move from the why AI in healthcare education to the what. We're going to look at the foundational discussions from that first session that we had, and then really go through the cultural, policy, legal, regulatory considerations of AI within the context of health professions education. We are so lucky to have Dr. Kimberly Lomas, who's going to guide us through this discussion. She's going to serve as moderator for most of today and tomorrow. She's Vice President for Undergraduate Medical Education Innovations in the American Medical Association. I encourage you to read her full bio. It is within the workshop materials, as well as the other speakers and the planning committee members. One last housekeeping note is that we have a question and answer function that is being monitored by the workshop planning committee. So please feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the session. We will aggregate those and answer those as appropriate. And with that, Kim, please unmute your microphone. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everyone. So as mentioned, I am with the American Medical Association, and the AMA is committed to helping physicians and all health professionals really take a lead in the responsible implementation of what we actually like to refer to as augmented intelligence. What is the optimal combination of computational abilities and human abilities to best serve our patients? And so as we contemplate the need for greater training in artificial intelligence across our health professions, as well as the potential role for AI to facilitate the process of educating those professionals as well, it is important that we explore the social, cultural, policy, legal, and regulatory considerations. So we're fortunate to have gathered an esteemed panel today to help us do so. I'll provide a brief introduction to the speakers. There is more information about them in the packets other than my colleague, Dr. Whalen, who's subbing at the last minute, so you won't find her there. So Allison Whalen is the Chief Academic Officer at the Association for American Medical Colleges. She is fellow author on our group's National Academy commentary piece on AI for Health Professions Education, which was recommended reading for this session, and there's a link to it at the top of the agenda. Nathaniel Hendricks is a researcher and data scientist with the American Board of Family Medicine and their Center for Professionalism and Value in Healthcare. His research focuses on cost-effectiveness analysis, pharmacoepidemiology, and artificial intelligence in primary care. Alex John London is a professor of ethics and philosophy and the director of the Center for Ethics and Policy at the Carnegie Mellon University. His work focuses on ethical and policy issues surrounding the development and deployment of novel technologies in medicine, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. So we're going to have a rich discussion. I do encourage people to put their thoughts and questions into the online platform. There will be time for discussion after the speakers have presented their thoughts. And so first we'll start with Dr. Whalen.
Hi, everyone. So this is kind of fun or terrifying, depending. But actually, I feel like I'm among friends. So if I screw up, it'll be okay. So going first is great because I really just wanted to raise a few questions and put us all on the same page. We're supposed to be talking about or framing the social, cultural, policy, legal, and regulatory ideas of things. But I actually wanted to start out and make sure we're all thinking about the same thing. And think about, so Kim had mentioned AI in health professions education was in that paper. It's really two different things. One is, what do the health profession students need to know, be able to do? What do they need to be competent in their health profession role? And the other part is, how can AI enhance the education piece? Related, but really very different. So I just wanted to start on a very positive note and think about where are some of the really high-level areas that we should be thinking about that AI can help with that. So here are some, key positives about thinking about AI in medical education. Personalization or precision education. AI can adapt to learning style and pace of individual students to provide personalized content and feedback. It can be involved in simulation. I think our simulation colleagues left. So can enhance what we already do to provide a safe and controlled environment to practice procedures, gain practical experience, gather skills, get feedback, and really have a developmental side of things. When constructed appropriately, predictive analytics. AI algorithms can help students identify areas of weakness, areas of growth, is really core to we think about those dashboards for competency-based education and really the growth mindset. AI, if we can do the right algorithms, will help with that as well. Think about remote learning. That AI-powered virtual or augmented tools, reality tools or otherwise, can really help students be more immersed regardless of where they are. That helps with accessibility and equity. And importantly, it can advance research in terms of thinking about both programmatic analysis and outcomes to really do that ultimate, which is, are we preparing our learners to have better patient outcomes? It's all pretty good, right? That's a pretty good list. So now let's talk about the social, cultural, policy, and legal part of things. As I talk with you, my education colleagues, or if I were presenting to medical students right now, or if you were to take this same scenario and it was in a patient room, do I have an obligation to tell you that 98% of that was created by ChatGPT at 1:15 this afternoon? Do I? Do I have a moral obligation as a healthcare professional? A legal obligation? Should I have a legal obligation? Because that's the truth, that I put in 15 words, it spit that out, and I jiggled it a little bit, but those ideas actually came from ChatGPT. Do I have an obligation, or did I have an obligation before I presented that to you to look it up? There are no references on that page. And I can't Google to those things. So is this evidence-based? Is it a synthesis of stuff that's out there in the world? Or did I make it up? I mean, sometimes we all make stuff up when we give talks, right? But if I were presenting, for a scholarly piece, I need to have the evidence. If I was presenting to students, how transparent do I need to be in that? And how transparent do I need to be in my own belief of those things? So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and say, this isn't how I normally write talks. I usually, so how do you write talks? So I'm going to talk about the social cultural, because I'm going to use those terms a little bit differently than I think maybe were meant by this group. But it's also sort of the social side of how do we think about what we do? What is scholarship? How should we be presenting? Normally when I give a talk, I do a little bit of thinking, I go out for a run, I think a little bit more, and I'm actually going to take us way back. When I first used to do scholarly things, and probably not everyone in this room, high school papers for me, maybe other people, you just read about it. I used to go to the library. I'd use a card catalog. I'd use Index Medicus. I'd go up to the stacks. If they didn't have it there, I could do interlibrary loan. And then I advanced, and I started collect. So this is the social cultural part of things. To me, it's a continuum. Fast forward, I had file cabinets of articles. This is my evidence-based repertoire of things, and I needed to be able to find those. Right? And we did, and didn't have a great way to make our bibliographies, but we did. And the people who had a more photographic memory or a better file cabinet did a better job with their talks being evidence-based. And then we happily, well, actually, sadly, it's hard for me to actually get rid of those file cabinets, even though I stopped using them. And we just Google searched everything. We Google searched scholarly articles, and then we put them in a standing bibliography so we could pull them out for our talks, we could pull them out for our papers, but it was electronic, but it was still very much the same thing. But then where does something like up to date or a evidence-based summary of things fall in there, or U.S. Preventive Task Forces services recommendations for things, which is the evidence is still there, but do you ever read beyond the abstract? Do you ever check to make sure the evidences are actually there? And what do we teach our students? And then I would say the social cultural part is that this is one step beyond that as well. And so I think we need to ask ourselves the same questions, which is what is our obligations as scholars, as educators, to teach our students how to be critical about those things, especially when there is something of a black box because we don't understand the algorithm. So I have no answers, I just have questions today. But we deal with lots of black boxes in medicine, whether it is the MRI machine, the thing that spits out, all the lab tests you order, et cetera, which are not even AI. They're, different kinds of algorithms. So what black boxes are okay that we don't understand? We just know the inputs and outputs, and what aren't. I think that's a discussion we all need to have. And then the last piece that I will add is thinking about our role as caregivers, or teaching our students to be caregivers. And that when we think about the conversations we have with our patients, and we talk about informed consent and the fiduciary experience with that. And in that, it is the do no harm, and it is also put the patient first. And we think about informed decision-making. There's always been an implicit belief, or always been implicitly true, mostly before, that the health professional was the relative subject matter expert. The person knew their preferences, their needs, their desires, but that we were relative subject matter experts. And the question is, in AI, will we still be the relative subject matter experts or not? What degree of expertise do we need to have? I have this really fabulous watch. It's a Garmin, so it actually does all kinds of things. It tells me time, tells me how many steps I had, it tells me how much I slept. It actually analyzes my sleep. It tells me my VO2 max. But I'm enough of a exercise nerd to know it's sometimes wrong. I mean, what it tells me about me is, no, that's not true. That's not accurate. So, and just extrapolate from that, the tools our patients may bring in, are they going to be more experts than we are? Do we deal with that black box? Where does our need, our expectation for truly being the expert so that we can have an informed joint decision-making with our patients? So again, more questions than answers, and I hope that frames the discussion for the rest of the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for raising those points. And actually, you provide a nice segue to Nathaniel Hendricks, who will be our next commenter. His work has been, you raised this issue that some of the things that concern us around AI and that are flagged as worrisome issues actually apply to how we've always done our work as well, right? So there has been some concern about our own vulnerabilities, and Nathaniel's work is looking at how do you measure the effectiveness of tools? And so I imagine he may take some of your ideas and carry them forward. So let's move into the next, and then we'll have discussion afterwards.
Thank you. You can see my slides? Yes?
You're all good, Nathaniel. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to be giving some perspectives from the fields of economics and decision science that reflect my own training on when and how to use clinical AI. But before I do that, I thought it would be helpful to look a little bit at why we might want to use AI. And to do that, I'm going to zoom back and look at the rise in healthcare prices over the past 23 years, and to see that since 2000, healthcare prices have increased at a rate over 50% higher than prices in the rest of the economy. And so I think it's worth asking, what makes healthcare different? One theory about that is that it's easier for other parts of the economy to take advantage of technology that can improve productivity. And with productivity improving, they can lower prices or at least raise them slower than inflation. But there are a lot of barriers to using technology to improve productivity in medicine. And increasing productivity in medicine is hard anyway. McKinsey estimates that productivity within healthcare grows at just 1/13 the rate of the rest of the economy. And that's not attributable to just any one barrier. There are regulatory barriers to including technology in healthcare. There are cultural barriers, both from healthcare professionals and patients. And of course, there's technological barriers too. It's simply hard to make technologies that improve clinical care. The economist William Baumol had, I think, a really useful metaphor for this phenomenon, which he called a cost disease. And he noticed that it takes the same number of musicians to perform a string quartet today as it did in the days of Bach. And even though the productivity of these musicians has stayed the same, their wages have raised with the rest of the economy. And so their lack of productivity growth can act as a drag on the rest of the economy. Everybody else has to be a little bit more productive so that they can keep up with the musicians. But we've found ways to handle that lack of productivity growth in certain sectors. And so for musicians, we take their services, their performance, and we turn that into a good. We put their performances on streaming services and we listen to them on our phones. And I want to say that maybe healthcare is similar. Maybe, it takes a certain amount of time and labor to do certain things, but maybe there are aspects of expertise that we can package into goods and use them anywhere and in ways that we deem appropriate. The real challenge, though, is how we integrate those AI systems into the rest of our work. And the writer Stuart Russell had a great analogy. He brought up the idea of how city planners will take the products of architects and engineers and put them together in a usable way so that people can live in cities and navigate cities and work in cities. And so I think it's time that we start thinking about how to take the products of computer scientists and statisticians that culminate in these AI systems and integrate them and make them usable within the clinic. There are quite a few different ways that AI can interact with clinicians, and here's 5. First off, AI can be a simple decision support tool. AI can give its recommendation to a clinician who makes the final decision, whether they consider the AI or not. AI can also act as a second opinion. So it can give a separate opinion from a clinician. And if they agree, then that's great. The decision is made. If they disagree, though, that can be referred to another clinician to make the final call. And that's something like the second reader system that they have for cancer screening in Europe. We can also use statistical methods to identify weaknesses in clinical decision-making by human clinicians and develop AI specifically to counteract those weaknesses. And then include clinicians and AIs as part of an ensemble that gets put together. Everybody's forecast or prediction gets put together and turned into a decision by the algorithm. Next, we can use AI as a triage. So for either very high or very low risk patients, we can use AI to make an independent decision. And when it's not very certain or under certain parameters, it can defer to a clinician instead who makes that decision. And then finally, there can be cases where we decide that unattended AI without human supervision can make a decision on its own. So one of the great things about AI is that there's no cognitive limit on the number of factors that it can use to estimate risk. And it can get a more accurate and more fine-grained risk prediction. So this figure is from a really great paper showing the benefit of diagnostic workup for people presenting to an emergency department for a suspected heart attack. And they've ranked people by the percentile of their predicted risk based on observable factors. And then on the vertical axis, they've looked at how much more benefit high-risk patients get from testing, this diagnostic workup, compared to low-risk patients. And what the authors of this paper found is that physicians don't accurately model risk. They give too much weight to certain symptoms like chest pain, and they give too much weight to age. We know that a lot of clinicians show what we call left-hand bias, where they look at the first digit of a patient's age and act differently based on that. So a 40-year-old is going to get a lot of tests that maybe a 39-year-old wouldn't, even though their risks are virtually the same. So I added the green triangles to illustrate what the risk of tested patients might look like with physicians. So physicians don't always test up to a certain risk percentile. They weight incorrectly. Whereas with an AI, we could set a threshold and say that we agree to work up any patient over the 60th percentile, the 80th percentile, or whatever we choose. And those decisions about the thresholds for treatment and recommendations are going to be pervasive as we work with AI, because AI never gives us a yes or no answer. It always gives us a numerical prediction. And so we have to figure out ourselves, how do we turn that into a decision or a recommendation? And that's going to vary by disease. So there are going to be cases where the benefits of detection outweigh the risks of false positives. Thinking here of cancer screening, where there's a second round of imaging and so forth. And here, we might want to set the threshold low so that we make sure that we catch almost all the positives, even though that means sacrificing some of our specificity there. There are other cases where the risk of false positives might be really high. If we have to do an invasive surgery to confirm a positive, we want to be very certain. And so we set that threshold for the prediction really high. And this gets even more complicated if we want a human in the loop, because we potentially have to set thresholds on both sides and figure out how certain do we have to be for either the high risk or the low risk population in order to allow for an automated decision. And so we'll be making decisions about how to use AI differently in different clinical circumstances. But we also need to take into account the algorithm's accuracy. And, we read about algorithms that outperform humans in one clinical task or another, and maybe that's true in certain cases, but accuracy alone usually doesn't give us enough to know whether there's an algorithm that's worth using. So on the left here, we've got an algorithm that quote unquote outperforms humans. That circle is bigger, it's catching more cases, but it's largely duplicating the work that clinicians do. And so we have to ask, what's the marginal value of adding that in? We could just be creating more problems by adding that in. On the right, we've got an algorithm that underperforms clinicians. It catches fewer cases, that circle is smaller, but the cases that it's catching are ones that clinicians probably would have missed. And this points to one of the big problems about how to communicate AI recommendations, because one of the best use cases for them is when they contradict clinicians. And so we need to understand how clinicians work with recommendations that contradict them. And this shows the result of an experiment where almost 140 radiologists were given decision support that was labeled as coming from AI. It was actually written by other radiologists, but presented to them as AI. And those red lines indicate cases where the radiologist recognized that they were being given inaccurate advice and they acted in a counter way. The blue lines show cases where the radiologists recognized that they were being given accurate advice and they acted in accordance with the advice. So we really have to separate this into two tasks: recognizing inaccurate advice and recognizing accurate advice. And we see here that physicians vary a lot in their ability to do those two tasks and that they're not necessarily correlated. Some physicians are really good at recognizing accurate advice, but not inaccurate advice, and vice versa. And just as physicians vary in their ability to work with AI, they vary in what they want from AI. And these are results from a series of experiments that I did with primary care providers and with radiologists to look at what they think is the most valuable attributes for AI in interpreting screening mammography. And so primary care providers have to communicate with their patients the risks and the benefits of using AI, while radiologists work directly with these decision support tools. And so they've got a different set of concerns. The primary care providers were much more concerned with sensitivity, with catching all of the cases of cancer, whereas the radiologists were concerned about limiting the number of false positives while also boosting the number of cases that we detect if we can. The PCPs were concerned with the evidence base for algorithms. They were really concerned with the diversity of the training set, whereas radiologists were more focused on how AI would be integrated into their workflows. And then maybe the most stark difference that I discovered was that with low-risk patients, about 75% of PCPs were willing to let AI make decisions without radiologist supervision. But that was a non-starter for radiologists. Almost none of them were willing to let AI work without their supervision. And just as physicians vary in what they want from AI. Patients do too. So in this recent poll from Pew Research Center, we see several differences across demographic groups in whether patients would be comfortable with their clinicians using AI. So we see that men are usually more comfortable than women with AI. Hispanic patients are more comfortable than non-Hispanic patients. And we see gradients where higher education and higher income are associated with being more comfortable with AI. And patients vary in their comfort about using AI for different use cases too. So most patients are comfortable with using AI in skin cancer, but not in mental health care. And so to make sure that AI can be a force to improve equity, we need clinicians who are able to talk to their patients about the benefits and risks of using AI. And, that points to some of the discussions that have been happening around anxieties about AI replacing clinicians. And I have to say, from an economic perspective, we wouldn't expect that. My hope is that we can use AI to make healthcare more affordable and more accessible. And what that will mean is that it makes those human complements to AI all the more important. But it's going to change the skills that we need in clinicians. So we need clinicians who are able to make a human connection, able to communicate with their patients, and who have a team orientation about their decision making. But we also need them to have the technical skills, the numeracy to understand what different recommendations from an AI mean, and enough knowledge about how these models are built and how they operate to communicate those risks to patients, but also to integrate those recommendations into their own work. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. I think that gave everyone some more concrete vision of the different ways that clinicians may interact with these tools. And I like your emphasis on the fact that this is predictive modeling and giving advice as opposed to a direct answer, which is often lost in the conversation. I think you raised some issues around accountability and bias that we'll probably continue to discuss as we move through this afternoon. So next we can turn to Alex John London for his comments. And please be thinking of your questions, add them online if you're joining us that way as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're going to have a lot to talk about. So I really appreciate the organizers giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about education and AI. And I want to talk about creating a more healthy scientific ecosystem. So first thing I have to say is that I don't have any conflicts to disclose regarding anything I say in the talk. And if I mention a product or a system, it's not an endorsement. Medicine is a context where uncertainty is pervasive. And how we deal with uncertainty is ultimately an ethical issue. So that if we're going to advance the moral mission of medicine, then that entails that we have to discharge our duty to learn. We have to learn how to reduce medical uncertainty. We have to learn how to reduce unwarranted variation in practice, because those are essential to making sure that health systems function effectively so we can improve patient outcomes, so that they can be efficient, so we can be good stewards of scarce social resources, and so that we can have health systems that function equitably as well, that they can treat all people who access those systems as moral equals. Carrying out the duty to learn partly involves a division of scientific labor. So lots of different experts in medicine produce information that other experts consume and that non-experts consume. And the reliability and the accuracy of this information impacts the ability of each of these stakeholders to be able to discharge important moral obligations. Whether we trust that information, that's also important, because if people don't trust information, they won't rely on it, and they won't act on it. Hype and fear are features that will degrade the health of a scientific ecosystem. So if you, they can do this by creating impediments to our ability to actually develop systems that are capable of performing tasks that are going to make health systems more effective or efficient or equitable. They can do this by making it more difficult to deploy systems or have uptake for systems that are effective. And they can get in the way of the review and revision of systems after they've been deployed. And so the risks here really are on two sides, that you don't want to underuse systems that are safe and effective. You don't want to overuse systems that are ineffective. And you don't want to misuse systems that might be effective to perform one task in one context. But if you use them to perform a different task in a different context, then you won't get the benefits that you expect. Sadly, medicine, sadly, I think the scientific ecosystem or the knowledge ecosystem in medicine related to AI is really unhealthy at the moment. And even good faith efforts to try to communicate and educate stakeholders in this domain about what AI can do often wind up perpetuating outsized expectations. So in this piece from the New England Journal, the authors say expert systems work the way an ideal medical student would. They take general principles about medicine and apply them to new patients, whereas machine learning approaches a problem as a doctor progressing through residency might by learning rules from data. Now, even though in the context, I think these things are sort of accurate as far as they go, but they perpetuate this idea that, well, just as medical students or physicians learn and they learn robust, information that they can sort of export across different contexts, sounds like AI is going to do the same thing, but of course, that's not the case. So a better way of thinking about AI, especially, in a way to try to get around these outsized expectations, is that it's a family of techniques for learning in the same way that radiologic imaging toolkits include flat images and computed tomography scans and functional images such as magnetic resonance imaging. So there are different machine learning techniques. They have their strengths and limitations. They're suited for different tasks. And improving the knowledge ecosystem in medicine would be an important step towards that would be doing a better job of training stakeholders and educating stakeholders in this space to understand what the differences are, what some of their limitations are, so that they can get away from the idea that their job is going to be displaced by a kind of synthetic human in a box. Unhealthy scientific ecosystem creates challenges across the life cycle of AI development and deployment. And I'm not going to go through each of these stages, but I'm going to give you a few points at a couple of stages that I think are really important, especially since medicine is at the forefront of AI. It is one of the places where AI is being applied and has been for a while. So I'd say 90% of the work in developing a safe and effective AI system is making sure that you have matched the capability of the system that you're trying to develop with a task that's clinically appropriate and that's going to advance some kind of priority health need for patients or health systems. So let's think back now to one of the major experiences that we've already had with artificial intelligence in medicine. So if you recognize the guy in the middle here, this is Watson. Watson conquered Jeopardy. And then after Watson conquered Jeopardy, Watson went to conquer cancer. And in a major paper about Watson, the authors say the goal of cognitive computing is to create automated information technology systems capable of solving problems without requiring human assistance. So of all the things that Watson could have been used to do, the idea was we want a kind of autonomous medical diagnostic system. Notice, as being reported later after the fact, but scientists behind Watson were really worried about the task that Watson was being employed to carry out. David Ferrucci said, Watson was engineered to identify word patterns and predict correct answers for a trivia game. It wasn't an all-purpose answer box ready to take on the commercial world. Notice that many of the ambitions that we've already talked about are not new ambitions. AI was supposed to augment the role of doctors and engage patients in order to expand access, lower costs, and improve outcomes. Those are all good goals. But what is this will here? Is it already possible? Or is it something that we hope to have as our eventual goal if eventually we can make systems work? the ambiguity in this is part of the sign of a kind of unhealthy knowledge ecosystem where we're not sure that we're being asked to buy a tool where these things are sort of validated and we're assured that we're going to get them if we use them, or if it's a promissory note where we're hoping that it will come to fruition at some point. What actually happened? Did the uptake of Watson advance these goals? MD Anderson partnered with IBM Watson to create an advisory tool for oncologists, which they ultimately shut down in 2016 after spending $62 million on it. I mean, to me, that seems like a lot of money, but I'm a philosopher. Recently, Watson Health was essentially sold for parts. So they got about $1 billion, it's been reported, for Watson, which also, again, sounds like a lot of money to me. But they spent $5 billion in acquisitions alone to put the Watson Health program together. This wasn't a mom and pop enterprise that failed because it lacked sort of the resource base. There were 7,000 employees that were employed in the Watson Health program at its peak. And it's been described in the media as a total failure that they just needed to walk away from and cut their losses on. So here's an example of a major blue chip corporation that had deep pockets and a major effort to try to make AI work in medicine. And part of the reason that it failed was a mismatch between what the capabilities were of that project or that system and the task that they set it out to perform in practice. Now, there's a more recent analog to this because you might say in technological terms, Watson is kind of in the deep past. It's a few years old. But in November, Meta released a large language model. So this, we just already heard about ChatGPT. So Galactica was another large language model like ChatGPT. Its job was supposed to be, yet again, help scientists synthesize the scientific literature so that they can better understand and better synthesize this literature. I think Galactica lasted 3 days, partly because you could get it to say racist things, partly because it fabricated claims, it fabricated citations, and I would be, just as an aside, what we can talk about in the conversation, I would be very reluctant to use ChatGPT or any other language model to write something that I would say, because it fabricates facts and it fabricates references when you ask for them. So again, this is a mismatch between, if the purpose of what you're doing is to try to synthesize material and convey facts in a more digestible form, large language models may not be the tool that you want. Even so, even if you've got the right kind of task, then data literacy is incredibly important because you need data that's going to be fit for purpose. And a lot of the healthcare data that we have is collected for other purposes, right? So the electronic medical record is still largely reflects billing, administrative, and clinical purposes. But very often the data that we need for research has to go beyond those purposes, either in its granularity or its frequency or its bandwidth, or the variables that we measure need to be broader. And so I think here, just a better awareness about the value and limitations of the data that we have relative to the data that we need when we want to learn would go a long way in helping stakeholders then evaluate the prospects for implementing AI in particular spaces. You can see this as a challenge even in what should arguably be low-hanging fruit. So image recognition is a particular strength of current generation AI systems. And so you might think being able to make diagnostic decisions from radiographs or other images should be, a task to which AI is very well suited. But of course, the way humans look at images, we separate out arbitrary features of the image from pathology relatively well. But machines don't look at images the same way we do. They look at a pixel and they translate that pixel into a number. And so in this paper, they note that most of the image subregions in the radiographs that they were looking at contained features that were indicative of a radiograph's origin or other features of hospital process that were associated with disease prevalence. So it makes it difficult not just to collect images that show the relevant pathology and don't show the relevant pathology so that you have the ground truth, but also the way these systems use that data will matter, because something that might accurately capture the ground truth for you and me might have confounders in it that at the machine level, the machine uses or conditions on those features to improve its accuracy, when out in the real world, those features aren't going to be there. And so accuracy is going to degrade. I'm going to skip over now to sort of prospective real world testing. Because I'd say this is another place where, so if you want to have a new drug or a new device, then the sort of regulatory requirements are very strict. And, we understand most new drugs don't work. Well, it's probably going to be the case that most new AI isn't going to work either. But we are still in a relatively immature state for validating AI systems as they come up. So these are two systematic reviews. They say things like there are relatively few prospective clinical trials of AI interventions. There are performance measures that are used in internal validation in the papers that describe these interventions. Often are not clearly linked to meaningful clinical outcomes. There's a high risk of bias in these papers. This also obtains now at the level of FDA approval, where many elements in the system that ensure quality in our knowledge ecosystem are kind of lagging behind. So this review by Wu and colleagues of FDA approved medical devices notes that none of the 54 high-risk devices that they evaluate were evaluated by prospective studies. And among the 130 devices that they analyzed, 93 didn't have publicly reported multi-site assessments included as a part of the evaluation. So that means the evidence base for those interventions derived from a single institution. Different features across different institutions can impact the safety and efficacy of these devices. And that's not reflected in at least what's publicly available about the way that these systems were validated. So we have room for improvement here, and I think our ability to improve would be enhanced by a broader education base among stakeholders about the strengths and limitations of AI systems at a more granular level. So the takeaway here, I think there is a duty to learn and to make health systems more effective and efficient and equitable. Health professionals right now are struggling to calibrate their expectations in a scientific ecosystem that's really inflated by hype and fear. I think AI and ML should be seen as one tool in a larger toolkit for learning, and our health education should approach them that way, like we do with other kinds of statistical methods. And that greater fluency with AI and ML is a first step to improving the health of our scientific ecosystem. So thanks a lot, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Alex. Your final point is exactly why we're convened today. There are certainly significant limitations and concerns, and it will take us being educated about it in order to intervene on the behalf of our patients and populations. So we have an opportunity now to have discussion with all the speakers. I have a few questions teed up from our online audience and encourage them to keep putting things in, and certainly those in the room will have an opportunity as well to ask questions. So be thinking about what you'd like more follow-up on. And there's been great points raised by all the speakers. One of the first questions that comes in, I think all of you touched on to some degree, and that is this notion of the shifting role of the clinician, the health professional, and how that plays out into the experience of the patient, especially with the concept of culturally competent care. And so you mentioned, Allison, this notion that in the past, the clinician has been seen as the steward of the knowledge, the possessor of knowledge. And even if we take AI out of the discussion for a moment, the explosion of information has made that increasingly difficult for us to do. We've had to shift a little bit in our role to be a little more of a curator or translator. Do you want to talk about that and how this issue of culturally competent care may require the interaction of the health professional with this information?
I think you already said it. Because the point I was trying to make is that, and I think the other two speakers did it even better, is that a lot of people are thinking of AI as this, completely different, and it is, and yet, to me, in many ways, it's a continuum of, how we use knowledge, who has access to knowledge, and what the purpose of that knowledge is. I actually loved how the other speakers talked about it, as just one of the many, many tools that we use as clinicians in managing knowledge. I was focusing mainly on managing knowledge, but it's managing knowledge, it's clinical decision making, and I think it could potentially be, in prioritization as well. And so I guess, in terms of the being inclusive with our patients, that to me is again a challenge that I think we need to find out if the information, are each of these tools designed in a way to be inclusive of our entire patient population? That to me would be the first question, even before we get to the communication piece.
Yeah, I think we can agree they probably are not. We know that there's been bias underlying our existing data sets already in there. So is the risk of amplifying that bias versus the opportunity to use AI effectively to maybe raise flags about that potential bias? Alex, you mentioned a little bit about...
Can I add one other thing to what you just said? So, and again, I am not an AI expert, but it's not just that our data sets are not representative, but that algorithms are created by people.
Yes.
And it has been shown in the commercial world that those algorithms often have the biases of the people who are creating them. So if the algorithms are not being created by diverse teams, they tend to be more representative or speak more to a certain population.
Absolutely. And I think, Alex, you mentioned the notion of bias in the development and training of these programs. I don't know if we wanted to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of important points. One is so the incompleteness of the representation of different groups in our data sets reflects incompleteness of access to health systems. And that's going to be a really hard problem to overcome. That is to say, the data problem is going to be a really hard problem to overcome while we have the disparities in access to our health system. That can sort of seem paradoxical in the sense that you might want AI to kind of lead to more efficient health systems or more equitable health systems, but because they're built on health system data, you kind of got to get the data first in order. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Then there are other problems in the sense that even things like the sensors that we use to produce data, so the Fitbit and the peripheral oxygen detectors, pulse oximeters, right? Like if green light works more effectively on light skin than dark skin, then the accuracy of those readings is going to differ across patient populations systematically. But those readings are the data that go into the AI systems or that go into the models that we build. And so the disparity isn't just about who's represented and who's not, but do we even have the technology to accurately represent, the underlying truth for each patient, or does the data that we get, is it itself biased because of biases or faults in technology? And then there are other cases where the technology, even relatively simple, gives us the correct answer, but historically medicine has injected race corrections where lung volumes are accurately measured by a spirometer, but lung volume data is treated differently than for white and black patients. And so all these things are going to be particular problems for AI because AI's models are built from data. And so the challenge that AI systems are going to inherent bias goes very, very deep in medicine.
Thank you for those thoughts. And actually, there's so many places where the issues around AI connect to things that we already teach. We talk about that these algorithms are being trained on data. Across our professions, we are a primary source of that data. And so when we think about how we currently teach our learners about documentation and capturing of information, and are we capturing the rich social context of our patients that might inform some of these things, it might be a nice reminder that it's more than getting a note done in this modern world, that we are actually contributing to the data that's going to inform these algorithms as they move forward. Nathaniel, you said something that was really intriguing to me, and I wonder if you could elaborate on it. And I like this a lot, the notion that AI may best contribute when it contradicts the clinician. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what type of clinician would handle that well. It raises to me the notion of the patient safety movement and the idea of a red flag. And so, would some clinicians see that contradiction and say, wait, this is a moment for me to pause and think more carefully about this case? Or do they get frustrated and reject? And so I wonder if you might elaborate on this notion of contradictory information.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why we have not had, we haven't had more progress in developing clinical tools is because as the culture of engineering and computer science merges with the more health-focused disciplines, I feel like a lot of the people building those algorithms have lost sight of what problem they're trying to solve. So, for example, if you are building an algorithm to interpret a certain medical image, most engineers will use labels that were assigned by humans, human clinicians. And that means that they are largely duplicating what humans do. Maybe they do it a little bit better and they move that needle a little bit, but I think that we should be building it to correct the mistakes that people are most likely to make. So use medical data to figure out which cases are clinicians missing, and then use an AI to detect those. I think that the skill to acknowledge that, to acknowledge when the contradictory advice that you're getting is right, as well as when it's wrong, I think comes about through practice. We know that people can do the work to calibrate their own predictions better. So I think it starts with physicians and other clinicians asking themselves how certain they are when they make a decision. And then maybe as they get a feedback from AI, they can look at how certain it is too. And if it's on the threshold, maybe they are comfortable counteracting it. But if AI is really certain, then I think that should definitely give them pause. But really, it's about working in an interdisciplinary environment, but bringing in these proxies of the computer science and engineering disciplines as well as health professionals.
Thank you. I do think we've seen a shift in recognizing more of our human fallibility. I think traditionally the health professions have had to feel like they need to strive for perfection, and we recognize that there's less safety. So this notion of acknowledging our vulnerabilities and trying to figure out a way that this could be a partner to help fill those gaps is really an intriguing idea. I want to pause and see if anyone in the room wants to pop on their microphone and ask any questions or raise any points that we haven't been covering so far. I've still got a series of things to ask, but wanted to give other folks a chance to jump in.
May I just, it's just a comment. I really, really appreciate both of you, Alex and Nathaniel. Nathaniel, what you just said in terms of using AI to bridge that gap. If there's inaccuracies in what we're doing, AI can help us figure out what to do. You just sort of answered my question, which was what communities are missing from the equation with AI. And it may be that. This is a diversified workforce that we're trying to build because of better outcomes. And I think when we start questioning ourselves and questioning our assumptions, that's the best way to do it, because then we're open to tools to fill in the gap, to help us bridge that, whatever gap that it might be. So thank you to both of you, Alex and Nathaniel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really exciting, the idea of using AI as a way of learning more and keeping that attitude of always learning and always being adaptable to updating your own assessment of how you do. Thank you.
Yeah, so Carol Tucker from the American Council of Academic Physical Therapy Programs. I also appreciated your concept that where AI really could benefit would be where it doesn't overlap with that. And I know within our profession, one of the things that has emerged is that the most successful clinicians are those that have been taught how to deal with variability in information they're receiving within their education program. So I know as we're thinking about competencies within AI, it almost comes back to also thinking about having students face that variability within context, if that makes sense. Like I hadn't even thought about those kind of tools embedded within AI competencies, but I think it really speaks to our ability to tolerate variability and being wrong as models. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very deep-seated desire to want to be certain, especially when we're making decisions that have really outsized consequences. And so I think that part of the role of clinicians is going to be in managing expectations and communicating clearly with their patients about the level of certainty that they have about anything that they're doing, and trying to evolve expertise not as being always authoritative and always decisive, but instead as managing uncertainty and doing the best that you can with the information that you have.
So I'd just like to add, though, that I think it's a special challenge to get the many different stakeholders to the table who need to be there in order to make sure that you're developing a system, whether it's a pretty simple system that humans understand because you're just using like regression, or something more complex that's AI. Ultimately, you're not going to get any benefit from a tool that people won't use. And so understanding people's workflow and what kind of tasks are central to their expertise that they're not going to want to delegate to a system, and what tasks they regard as laborious, low value, where they would like to offload those to some other system in the way that would then increase their productivity or increase their that like free up their time to do things that are more value or spend more time with patients. But AI is not going to do that of itself, right? Like that requires that you have people who understand how to make AI systems partnering with people who understand medicine, medical workflows to identify low-hanging fruit where these things can add real value, and where clinicians aren't afraid, or healthcare providers of any kind aren't afraid to use them because they feel that they're stepping on their on their sort of professional territory, which there's been a lot of research on, in lots of other domains as well. In the legal domain, people don't want to use AI systems precisely because they feel like it's when it tramples on their expertise.
I think there's a really interesting corollary to that, which is that as these systems become more capable, figuring out the exceptions to when they don't behave well is going to become even more important. And that requires the development of clinical judgment. But if you're working in an environment where these systems are so capable, that has the potential to reduce the number of opportunities that you have to develop that clinical judgment. And so I think that those have to be created intentionally. And that might be by reducing the number of circumstances in which AI might intervene, sort of taking off autopilot, even though it could operate in those circumstances, so that people have the opportunity to develop and retain their clinical judgment.
Yeah, so there's an interesting combination in these last few comments of, we'll be talking a lot tomorrow about what competencies our health professionals need to use AI, but we're also thinking a little bit about what attributes of those individuals may be different than what we've historically recruited to. Several have been rattled off already, team orientation, numeracy around predictive modeling, this notion of humility or being able to accept input from other sources. And so it's an interesting thing to think about because on one hand, it sounds as though one of the advantages would be to offset administrative or burdensome activities in order to focus more on the human interaction and really help that individual patient use the information as best possible in their care. But we're starting to put together features that stereotypically we wouldn't see in the same person. We're talking about someone who can do data analytics and computational stuff and is really interpersonally skilled. And I think it's an evolving thing that we may see societally that those things start to merge together, whereas traditionally you would have not necessarily seen that in the same person. I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts about implications for selection, who we're recruiting into our professions, what skills we look at in the process of even recruiting these learners to our fields. Want to jump in on that, Allison?
Sure. So, gosh, I thought we were trying to recruit students who had a growth mindset and humility and empathy and all those things.
Trying. Are we
So-
doing it, though?
So I would like to hope that hasn't changed, that maybe we need better tools and more holistic admissions, et cetera, for those kinds of things. So I guess to me, so we should do a better job with that. To me, I see the interprofessional team expanding. And that I am not going to be, I will never be an informatics person, even if I was 20 years old now. And, that's not what I would do. Just like I would never have been a radiologist or, whatever, any number of different things. But I do think that we need to think about our teams of healthcare teams, including people that we didn't before. And so just like when we think about professional education and interprofessional practice, is really understanding what those other professionals bring to the team, that we need to expand that as well. And that includes engineers, it includes IT people, includes a lot of others as well. I'm not going to be them, but I need to understand what they be, and we need to be able to speak enough of the same language. So I think that is change, again, a plug for IPE, but expanding IPE and the competencies related to that.
Yeah, I think the topic that you really raise, which is the interface of the culture of the physician and the patient and data, and the change that has to recognize those differences. I was thinking of 20 years ago, when you think of solving crime and you thought of the FBI agents and what they were, and they resisted informatics coming into crime solving. And then they finally had to hire a whole bunch of young kids who wouldn't carry guns, who didn't do all this sort of stuff. And it changed the whole way the old-time FBIers thought. I think about pilots, and now how much, if you saw from the cabin, is being done completely automatically. We would probably all be very scared on even takeoff and landings now. And you think of autonomous driven cars, and you think of this next generation. And so I wonder about, A, the interface between the physician culture and this technology, and why we have to be more sensitive or understand that, and the need for more commonality, both in training and after they're out of training, but in practice. And how important that is in this particular field. And I wonder if it's going to be the same for people our age or the young coming into the profession now, and they're willing to embrace black boxes because they've played all their games on black boxes that they don't understand. And it'd be interesting to see if there's also a cultural difference as well.
So can I say something about that? Because I think it's very difficult for us to kind of look outside of the things that we take to be normal and recognize that a generation ago, other people were very reluctant to give up on certain things. So like an example I like to use with my students is in the movie Hidden Figures. There's a scene where John Glenn is like, I want, I'm sorry, I forgot the woman's name. I want this woman to calculate my reentry trajectory, not the computer. Now, I expect that it would be impossible at NASA today, to go and say, I want a human to calculate the reentry trajectory of a space vehicle that's carrying humans in it. But like at the time when computers were new, right, this is something that people didn't want to do. Your old car used to be mechanical, all pieces fit together. Now, when you turn your steering wheel, there's a computer that sends a signal to something else. So like we accept lots and lots of computation and automation in our lives today that other people didn't. And I think the difference, though, is in a lot of these cases, so especially like with airplanes, there are very few airplane crashes anymore. And a lot of this comes from like automation, systematization, eliminating free parameters. And medicine needs that, right? In the sense that like medicine, if you think about operating theaters and the lessons they learn from airlines and trying to reduce the amount of variability and variation. So on the one hand, I think that's really important, and being able to think in terms of regularity and, statistical thinking is a key skill that we need. And I think it's an antidote to kind of the hype with the idea that the box is a little human. So one of the things that bothers me, for instance, is when I'm teaching pre-med students and like they tell me they have to learn calculus, as part of their pre-med curriculum, but their requirements for the statistics courses that they have to take are not as rigorous. And, I was like, look, if our people going into medicine were required to have a higher level of statistical literacy, we would have a lot fewer problems if the old name for AI had stuck, which was just automated statistical inference. Not as sexy, so it's not going to sell as much, right? But like it tells you what it is. And I think increasing our statistical literacy would help with exactly some of these problems.
Just to build on those last two from Richard and from the comment that was just made, I think it seems to me that there may be a difference as we think about competencies right now versus 20 years from now. And your comment about automated cars made me think of this, where where it's immature right now. And so I think, as I'm teaching my children how to drive currently, I'm very nervous if they were to get into an automated car, because I don't think that they have the judgment to know when it's right or wrong, or when they should take over the wheel or move it in a different direction. And that's because it's still I think in 20 years, if every car's automated, that's probably better than any of us actually taking over the wheel. But we're at this point, at least it seems, in healthcare where it's still immature. And so that competency of, Kim, you asked what's that competency of the physician in relation to data science. And it's not clear to me what that is right now. It seems really complicated and difficult to get to understand that. And I also think it's probably different than it is 10 years from now.
Just want to follow up a bit on, kind of this, what you said, Kim, about these seemingly kind of disparate characteristics in the same person. We'll say that interviewing some of the informatics and AI people and the informatics people that we know at Vanderbilt are really pretty humble. And I think they know as well as anyone the limitations. And so I think if there's an opportunity to have some of those experts talk to our students, because it's always surprised me how kind of these people like Bill Stead are equal right brain and left brain. And so I think that it may not be quite as oppositional as it may seem, just to say that.
No, I totally agree. And you look at some of the degrees that are more common now around design and design thinking, and the purposely grooming people to to balance those demands. And Richard, you talked a little bit about shifting. You were saying specifically physicians, and because this group is interprofessional, I wanted to ask folks, you know, how do we think this, you mentioned this a little bit as well, Allison, that it would expand who's on the team, but how could this change our roles and our interactions with each other? Have people started to think about, obviously, we all need training in this, we're all learning at the same time. So this is an area that's rich for IPE, but in terms of interprofessional practice, do we need to be talking about shifts and changes in that might be prompted by the ability to use some of these tools? Any thoughts?
I think there's some very interesting things in terms of AI, in terms of what goes into it, in terms of the whole panoply of educational options when you're talking about patient-centered care, in terms of the whole person and whatnot. Occasionally, when you get into healthcare, you're talking about specialization. You're looking at one area versus another. I think of an example where you've got a patient who's got some kind of orthopedic issue. As some years ago playing tennis, I was sent to an orthopedic surgeon, and his answer to me when I went and visited says, "Let's cut." Well, I went back to my doctor and said, "You know what he said?" He said, "Let's cut." He said, "Well," he said, "That's what they do. That's what they're going to be their answer." As an algorithm, when you get into other, be PT or chiropractic care or whatever types of care that's out there, those parts of the AI have got to put those kind of things into play in order for you to be able to give an overall answer. If you're trying to avoid OxyContin as a pain management system, how do you do that and get into a system? And that's going to be the critical issues that I see initially facing right now.
If I can give a specific example, I was at a conference on nutrition earlier this week, and it's still working in process. But the idea was primary care physicians don't know how to counsel patients about nutrition, and there's even more of a great shortage of dietitians than there are of physicians. So it's a prototype, but a academic group of dietitians created a tool where the patient does an online dietary intake. No one likes to do dietary intakes. And then the dietitians created the sets of algorithms to analyze that. And it's done in the primary care physician's office. So then it spits out at a very high level, sort of not a grade, but sort of an assessment of the diet, assessment of the dietary intake, and then 3 priorities with 1 specific tip, and then a connection to evidence and data from the dietitian saying, these are things that you could do, and then also how to refer. And so it's sort of building that interprofessional practice through an AI tool that was created by the dietitians. And it's in early stages, but the initial phases that they presented were double the number of changes in dietary interventions by the patients who were given that intervention versus not, and an increase in competence of the primary care doctors just because they read this thing every time it was put in front of them. So I think it's really an idea to think about. So that's one area, but to really think about how we really do interprofessional practice and use AI in those kinds of nuggets. We need a lot more research and development there, but it's awesome.
It's a great example. Nathaniel, I remember in our prep call you had mentioned that we can't just plug AI into our existing structures and processes. Do you want to chat a little bit about how you would see us changing things a little bit?
Yeah, I think that, a great metaphor that I've heard, and you can probably tell I like to think in metaphors a lot, is that you can't take a Rolls-Royce engine and put it in a Toyota and expect the Toyota to drive better. It's going to stop working. So the fact is that simply providing better information without any way to act on it without making it actionable or interpretable is just as likely to be a burden to people if there aren't clear workflows around how to integrate that. So I've read some studies of sepsis prediction in ICUs, and a lot of times they end up being a burden because of false positives, because nobody knows quite what to do with them. And so I think that every time we implement one of these algorithms, we need to consider what does this mean for the decisions that we make, for the actions that we take, and who takes them. I think that's another important component. I think that turning our focus to the large language models like GPT-4, I think one of the things that it's going to enable is for people to stay on top of the scientific literature more. There are search engines out there specifically for scientific literature that are driven by large language models. And you ask it a question and it takes the relevant little bit from each paper. And that's really interesting to give you a first glimpse to see, is this a controversial area? Is there broad agreement? How long has there been broad agreement? Where are people talking about this and who's talking about it? I think though provides a really good way to at least enter into a field of evidence that you're maybe less familiar with, and it provides an opportunity to expand everybody's access to those resources.
Thanks for those comments and the notion of thinking carefully about what we do with the information that we get. And I did want to acknowledge that touches on some of the online comments that we haven't gotten to. The one speaker who's missing today was going to address the issue of accountability and regulation, which has come up in several of those who are commenting online. And so certainly the notion of what does a clinician need to know about the oversight of an algorithm, how it is developed, how it is monitored. And so there are organizations cropping up that actually do external audits and provide that kind of guidance. And I think we'll pick up on that tomorrow in our discussion of competencies, because that's a major challenge for most of us. We're looking around the room. We have just a couple minutes left. Sorry.
Okay, just a quick, it's a piggyback on that thought. It was, as you were speaking, I really liked as well the comment earlier about the competency of clinicians being able to ascertain their own confidence in what or certainty of their decision. Would it be possible for the algorithm or the AI, as it's giving you a recommendation, with what certainty am I giving you this recommendation, and with what biases is this decision or recommendation made on? That if we have clarity on the bias of the data and clarity, because as we think about, as something he just said made me think, when it spits out a recommendation, we don't have a sense of, well, is there contradiction in the field? How many reference points was that recommendation built on? And so some layering of referencing, I guess, of the recommendation would be helpful to be able to see when and if we should use it.
I think it's.
Sorry, Daniel. That was actually what I was going to say in terms of being culturally responsive. Like the diet in Hawaii, my parents would probably not eat the things that's listed because their indigenous food may not have been included. However, the input into AI may just spit it out. So in my mind, I was just thinking about how do we make it so that it is culturally responsible to people.
So specifically on that one, so it's being developed in Texas, and it's currently just in Spanish and English, but actually does represent a diet that represents the very strongly Hispanic culture there as well. So it's only the beginning, but I think it
But
did recognize that.
that's pretty awesome for the language also. just real quickly. So I was trying to get myself a blood works. And so they said, call in and, give your name. They couldn't get my first name. So finally I just said HALA. And he took it because he understood HALA. So I'm going to be getting blood works with HALA because it took it. But the language piece that you're talking about, I think we're just in an infancy, like Sandra was saying, we're immature, but we're going to give ourselves some grace and we're going to keep moving forward with this. So that's wonderful to hear that it's in the Spanish language now.
In terms of being in infancy, the legal system is so far behind in all of this, but the issue is going to be, so you relied upon this AI advice you get here. How updated was this? Did it include data on this profession or that profession? Did it include it in English or Spanish? A lot of those kind of things are what they're facing now with Microsoft and all the Facebook and all those kind of things. And will be, until we figure out what it is we can do. And I remember 10, 15 years ago, Senator Wyden talking about privacy in terms of what the degree of privacy. And now these things are all coming back as we figure out the political dynamics of what you can put in. Ask Dominion voting people right now. But I think those are the other aspects of it in terms of what the reliance is, in terms of your own independent judgment as a clinician, which has always been a big parcel of not only what's evidence-based, it's always part of a clinician's experiences and things.
Great discussion, great thinking points. So I first want to thank Kim as well as Allison, Nathaniel, and Alex for just some really thought-provoking and setting the framework and kind of leveraging where we were the other day. I want to remind everyone that we'll start at 9 a.m. sharp tomorrow and move from kind of asking what are the big issues in AI to really think about the how. How are we going to move these into our education programs? We do have Dr. Bonnie Miller joining us tomorrow to explore applications of AI. And just before everyone goes, a lot of this discussion, I guess I'm going to take a little advantage of having the microphone. I've been really thinking about a lot of this in terms of how could it improve my relationships when I work with patients. And on Friday afternoons, I go to a pediatric chronic care clinic. Lovely, OT, PT, social work, physician. And the physician happens to be a neonatologist, but what shows up in this clinic, because they fall through the cracks, are those 18-year-olds, right? Complex medical history that are transitioning to adult care that can't get answers, but they are certainly fluent in ChatGPT. So this was the conversation, it was also bilingual. And so the 18-year-old says, is the condition I have generic? And we all look at each other and are thinking genetic. So you can imagine if this was, so I'm sitting there thinking, well, it's a good thing we're there. And then the next question really was, why? And so the physician turns and Googles, because what else it's like we're here. We're going to be using these algorithms. Let's have influence. And she said, well, it looks like there could be a genetic component. We could send you out for testing. And he goes, the neurosurgeon I saw last year said it wasn't. And so I'm already thinking of being able to Google during the visit and thinking about having that conversation. But what he really wanted to talk about was issues in transitioning and relationships, right? And so just being able to say genetic, yes, but let's explore it deeper. And so when I look at this interprofessional clinic that we're trying to do, I could see a partner with our AI algorithms that frees us up to really have those. That's what he wanted to get at. And he did make a comment, oh, well, that's now the same answer that I got when I did this on ChatGPT, so I trust y'all. And so, again, I think we're going to be running into this group of patients that are going to be equally sophisticated. So just something to really think about, both the perils and how it could help us, and really what we need to do to make sure that we're at the table for all of these discussions. So enjoy dinner, enjoy the slightly, for me, I came from where it was snowy up north, but I live in Houston, so I'm just confused. But enjoy your evening out walking. Thank you.